A little help from Poland. The Americans knew that Burgundy was coming. It was time to pick a spot and get ready for the showdown. Benedict Arnold and a Polish officer engineer named Thaddeus Kosciuszko got on their horses and started looking for the perfect place to fight. Kosciuszko, or Kos, as the Americans called him, was a new addition to the Continental Army. Back in Poland, he had tried to elope or to run off to be married with his girlfriend, but the woman's father caught the young couple and gave Kosciuszko two choices: fight him in a duel or get out of Poland. Kos didn't want to kill the old guy, so he decided to leave his country. And as so many people have done since, he traveled to the United States in search of new opportunities. He met George Washington, and their conversation went like this. Washington asked, "What do you seek here?" Kos answered, "I come to fight as a volunteer for American independence." Washington replied, "What can you do?" Kos, "Try me." Washington liked the guy's attitude. Though he had terrible trouble spelling the name Kosciuszko, he spelt it 11 different ways during the war. Washington sent Kos north to join the Northern Army. An expert at designing and building forts near rivers, Kos was exactly what the Americans needed in September 1777. Kos and Arnold found a hill above the Hudson River near the town of Saratoga. This looked like a good place to try to stop Burgundy. Kos took out his notebook and started sketching ideas for forts. They would have to be simple forts. The British Army would be there in just a few days. Papa Franklin. Back in France, Franklin eagerly opened every letter from home, hoping to read about a great American victory, but there had been no great victories yet, and to make things worse for poor Ben, he had to decode the letters before reading them. One letter began like this: "I am very glad that 105 is going to 156, and I'm sure it will please 38 of 68." That was a simple code, using numbers to stand for important people and places. Codes were necessary because Franklin was absolutely surrounded by British spies. He didn't know it at the time, but even his own personal secretary was selling information to the British. Still, Franklin hated working with codes. He found it boring. Why were the British so interested in Benjamin Franklin's secrets? They were worried Franklin might be in France to do more than just work out a treaty. Franklin was world famous for his experiments with lightning and electricity, and there were wild rumors that Franklin was now in France to build some sort of electrical machine that could destroy all of Britain. Most British secret agents actually described Franklin's plan like this. He proposed to have a chain carried from Calais, France, to Dover, England. He, standing in Calais with a prodigious electrical machine of his own invention, will convey such a shock as will entirely overturn our whole island. The truth is, Franklin was spending most of his time eating and drinking. The fancy people of Paris invited Franklin to parties every night, and he was too polite and hungry to refuse. Everyone in France, it seemed, wanted to get a close look at Franklin's simple American clothes and his beaver fur hat. Artists and sculptors gathered around to paint and sculpt his famous face. Young women lined up to kiss his cheek and called him Papa Franklin. Then they rushed to their wig makers and asked for wigs shaped like the Franklin's fur hat. This was called wearing your hair a la Franklin. Franklin knew that most of the stuff was pretty silly, but he also knew that he wasn't wasting his time. Franklin's fame and popularity were actually powerful tools. One dinner party at a time, he was winning the French people over to the American cause. If only the American army could help him out a little. The Battle of Saratoga, Part 1. Now back to New York. After a week of sweaty work under a killer summer sun, the Americans completed a fort at Saratoga. And just in time, too. Burgundy's army attacked the American fort on September 19, 1777. The Battle of Saratoga was on. Just before the attack began, a general named Horatio Gates arrived at Saratoga to take command of the Northern Army. Gates was a careful commander, a guy who didn't like to take chances. Soldiers nicknamed him Granny Gates because the way he wore his glasses on the tip of his nose made him look like an elderly woman. Gates wanted to keep his army inside the fort and fight from behind the walls of earth and logs. General Benedict Arnold disagreed. Arnold, who was second in command, wanted to charge out of the fort and fight in the woods and fields. As always, Arnold made his opinions known to everyone. So him and Gates argued for a while. Finally, Gates got so annoyed that he gave Arnold permission to take some soldiers out to fight. This turned out to be a very important decision because it ruined the British battle plans. Burgundy had been planning to roll his cannons right up to the American fort. Instead, the two armies crashed into each other in a field surrounded by forests. The Americans used the trees to their advantage, climbing up to high branches and firing their rifles down on the British with deadly accuracy. The deafening blast of guns and cannons continued all afternoon, making soldiers on both sides feel like they were stuck in the center of a non-stop thunderstorm. Such an explosion of fire I had never had any idea of before, said a young British lieutenant named William Digby. An American officer named Roger Lamb agreed. Both armies seemed to be determined on death or victory. As usual, Benedict Arnold was out in front of his men, charging right at the enemy's guns. Arnold rushed into the thickest of the fights with his usual recklessness, and at times acted like a madman, reported an American general named Enoch Poor. Arnold's fellow soldiers weren't sure if Arnold was very brave or very insane. Some thought he must be drunk. There was no evidence that he was. But in the British camp, Barons von Rysdale listened to the battle with horror. I shivered at every shot, she said, for I could hear everything. She watched as the wounded men were carried back to camp, terrified that her husband would be among them. He wasn't. Only darkness ended the fighting that day. Though more than 1,000 men had been shot, neither side had won the battle. The exhausted armies collapsed and rested. The Battle of Saratoga, Part 2. This battle left Burgundy in serious trouble. He lost many of his best officers, and his army was nearly out of food. He wanted to try attacking the Americans one more time, but his soldiers were too tired. Still, he absolutely refused to retreat. Meanwhile, in the American camp, the uneasy relationship between General Gates and Arnold exploded. Gates wrote his official report to Congress on the Battle of September 19th. Even though Benedict Arnold had much of the fighting that day, Gates didn't bother to mention Arnold's name in the report. Arnold stormed into Gates' tent, accusing Gates of jealousy and disrespect. Gates calmly responded by removing Arnold from command. Gates ordered Arnold to go into his tent and stay there. Now, a series of tense days and nights followed. By day, the Americans kept a constant watch for the attack they knew must be coming. By night, they were haunted by the barks and cries of hungry wolves that gathered in packs to scratch at the shallow battlefield graves. Wolves dragged out the bodies, and well, you can imagine, it was a rough 3 weeks. Then, on October 7th, the British attacked again. The top American officers raced to General Gates to get his battle orders. When Gates started naming the soldiers he wanted to send into battle, Benedict Arnold, who was supposed to be in his tent, interrupted with his opinion. Arnold said, "That is nothing. You must send a stronger force." Gates responded, "General Arnold, I have nothing for you to do. You have no business here." Arnold spat out a series of unprintable curses as he walked back to his tent. He paced back and forth for a while, listening to the sounds of the gunfire. Then he just couldn't take it anymore. He jumped on his horse and rode towards the battle, shouting, "Victory or death." Gates ordered him to come back, but Arnold was already gone. On the battlefield, American soldiers cheered when they saw Arnold coming. Arnold rode all the way to the battlefield, leading charges and driving British and German soldiers backward. During one charge, he was shot in the leg and fell from his horse. "Rush on, my brave boys," he called from the ground. And the Americans did rush on. This time he won a clear victory over the British. Johnny loses the bet. Now Burgundy's only hope was to try to escape before the Americans attacked again. Baroness von Rysdale and her daughters climbed into a wagon and headed north. "We had been warned to keep extremely quiet," she remembered. Thus we drove on and all through the night. Little Frederica was very much frightened, often starting to cry, and I had to hold my handkerchief over her mouth to prevent our being discovered. While all this was happening, a second British army finally got around to helping Burgoyne. General Henry Clinton led British soldiers north up the Hudson, capturing some American forts. A British messenger, Daniel Taylor, hurried towards Burgoyne with the good news. Taylor had been spotted by the Americans while traveling north. However, and just before he was captured, he was seen to pull something out of his pocket and swallow it. The Americans forced Taylor to drink a nasty potion which caused him to throw up and outshot a silver bullet. Taylor tried to grab the bullet and swallow it again, but the Americans snatched it first. They unscrewed the hollow bullet, and inside was a note from General Clinton. Obviously, Burgoyne never saw that note, and by October 17th, Burgoyne's army was out of food. They could go no farther. Gentleman Johnny took off the uniform he had been wearing for the past 16 days and put on a clean one. He wanted to look nice when he surrendered to the Americans. More than 5,700 British and German soldiers marched out to surrender. Trailing behind them were the pets they had picked up during their stay in the forests of New York, including foxes, raccoons, deers, and one black bear. Thus ended all our hopes of victory, honor, glory, said the British Lieutenant William Digby. Digby said that if he had been alone, he would have burst out crying. One of the British felt even worse when they got a closer look at the army that had just wiped them. Not one of them was properly uniformed, said a British soldier of the Americans, but each man had on the clothes in which he goes to the field, the church, or to the tavern. No, the American soldiers don't have fancy uniforms, but at Saratoga they gained something much more valuable, the first major victory over the British. Ben seals the deal. The news of Burgoyne's surrender lifted us up to the stars, wrote John Adams. Wait till Ben Franklin finds out. In early December, a carriage pulled up to Franklin's house in France. Franklin had been hearing rumors that General Howe had captured his hometown of Philadelphia. Franklin rushed up to the messenger. Franklin, sir, is Philadelphia taken? Messenger replied, It is, sir. But, sir, I have greater news than that. General Burgoyne and his whole army are prisoners of war. Burgoyne, a prisoner of war, that changed everything. After months and months of avoiding Franklin, France's King Louis and his officials finally agreed to work out a treaty with the United States. Franklin prepared for his new meeting with King Louis by hiring the best wig maker in Paris. No one showed up to see the king without a nice wig. Unfortunately, the wig maker made Franklin a wig that didn't fit. A Paris newspaper reported the scene. Franklin, perhaps your wig is too small. Wig maker, no, your head, sir, is too big. The newspaper reporter added his own comment. It is true that Franklin does have a fat head, but it is a great head. Anyway, Franklin decided to go to the palace in his plain brown suit and his plain bald head. The king's servants were horrified. At first, they didn't even want to let him into the palace. Everyone waited, too scared to breathe, as Franklin boldly stepped up to meet King Louis. Luckily, Louis didn't seem to care about Franklin's head one way or the other. He simply looked at Franklin and said, Assure Congress of my friendship. I hope this will be for the good of the two nations. And that was that. Franklin's mission was accomplished. The turning point. Now you can see why the Battle of Saratoga is called the turning point of the American Revolution. The Continental Army had won its biggest victory yet over British. And this victory convinced France, one of the most powerful nations in the world, to join forces with the United States. The members of Congress were so excited they gave General Gates a special medal to celebrate the Battle of Saratoga, and at night members and their wives did a new dance called the Burgundy Surrender. Not everyone was dancing though. Stuck in a hospital bed in Albany, Benedict Arnold was recovering very slowly from his wound. Army Surgeon James Thatcher reported, Last night I watched with the celebrated General Arnold, whose leg was badly fractured by a musket ball while in the engagement with the enemy. He is very peevish and impatient under his misfortunes. It wasn't just the pain in Arnold's leg that was bothering him. He was tortured by the fact that Gates was getting the glory he felt belonged to him. We'll be hearing more from Benedict Arnold. Will we ever win this war? In 1777, Joseph Plum Morton, now 17, decided to rejoin the Continental Army. He agreed to serve until the end of the war. The general opinion of the people was that the war would not continue 3 years longer. Morton said, "Don't tell Joseph, but the American Revolution was going to last 6 more years." A long way from victory. Sure, the Americans had won that great Saratoga victory, but the British were still determined to smash this revolution. And they still had thousands of soldiers in the United States. In fact, they had thousands of soldiers in the capital of the United States. In September 1777, while Burgoyne was fighting in New York, the main British army, under the command of General William Howe, captured the city of Philadelphia. Members of Congress packed very quickly and escaped to York, Pennsylvania. Now the winter of 1777 approached, and George Washington was facing the same old maddening problems: lack of soldiers, lack of food, lack of clothing. The army was now not only starved but naked, and, said Joseph Plum Morton, the greatest part were not only shirtless and barefoot, but destitute of all other clothing, especially blankets. No, the Americans were nowhere near winning the war. Terrible times at Valley Forge. Washington decided to keep his army close to Philadelphia that winter. He wanted to make sure General Howe didn't make any sudden unexpected moves. So in December 1777, 11,000 American soldiers marched towards a place called Valley Forge, about 20 miles west of Philadelphia. Some of the men were so exhausted by the march, they leaned on their guns and slept standing up. Others were more worried about their aching feet. Dr. James Thatcher reported it was not uncommon to track the march of the men over ice and frozen ground by the blood from their naked feet. There wasn't much at Valley Forge, but some bare trees and windy hills covered with frost and dead grass. Since some kind of shelter was needed, Washington ordered the men to build log cabins. 12 soldiers would live in each log cabin. The men who knew how to build log cabins finished theirs in 2 days. Then they helped the city boys, who had no idea how to build a house out of logs. Washington knew his army was facing a dangerously long, hard winter. Martha Washington, who came to stay at Valley Forge, could see the concerns on her husband's face. The general was well, but much worn with fatigue and anxiety. I never knew him to be so anxious as now. Martha and the other women in camp knitted socks and shirts as fast as they could, and the men badly needed the clothing. Some had nothing but ragged summer clothes, and they could be seen dashing from hut to hut wrapped in blankets. When soldiers were on duty, they stood on their hats to keep their bare feet from freezing solid in the snow. When they weren't on duty, they shivered in their cabins, coughed from the smoke from their fires, and trying to ignore the hunger pains in their bellies. Dr. Abigance Waldo described life at Valley Forge in a few hoarse statements. "I am sick, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit half my time, smoked out of my senses. The devil's in it. I can't endure it. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze?" The only one who had anything nice to say about Valley Forge was a young soldier named Richard Wheeler. "We are very comfortable and are living on the fat of the land," wrote Richard Wheeler to his mother. Richard wasn't quite telling the truth. He just didn't want his mom to worry. And she would have to worry, had she known that there was so little food at Valley Forge that horses were starving to death and dropping dead in the middle of the camp. Men also starving were too weak to bury the heavy horses. The carcasses of dead horses were lying in and near the camp, complained Washington. The rotting horses' bodies stank up the camp and helped spread disease among the weakened soldiers. An increasingly desperate and angry George Washington watched more than 2,500 soldiers die from cold, hunger, and disease at Valley Forge. He was furious with Congress for not doing more to supply the army, and he knew that if the British chose this moment to attack, his army would be ruined.